Okay, thank you, friends, for joining this Catholic Climate webinar along with Catholic Energies. This webinar is to describe the opportunities we in the faith community have to put our faith into action through renewable energy investments and funding. And before I get started, I'd like to introduce myself and our speakers briefly. My name is Jose Aguto. I'm the Executive Director of the Catholic Climate Covenant and delighted to be sharing some good news with you today, having worked on climate legislation for decades and seeing this manifest in the past month. But before we begin, I have some housekeeping information. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you within 48 hours. There's a chat feature that you can use to communicate with others on the webinar. Do note that the chat feature will not be saved at the end of the webinar. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you know who the question is directed to, please add that information. Once again, we're delighted to have you here, blessed to be accompanying you in our shared vocation to protect God's creation in the fullness of our Catholic faith. And we want to take a moment to quiet ourselves and bring ourselves into prayer, and delighted to invoke the 2022 season of creation prayer, apropos as our season of creation started on September 1st. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Creator of all, from your communion of love, your word went forth to create a symphony of life that sings your praise. By your holy wisdom, you made the earth to bring forth a diversity of creatures who praise you in their being. You called human beings to till and keep your garden, but we turn in on ourselves and away from our co-creatures. We fail to listen to the cries of the poor and the needs of the most vulnerable. We silence the voices of those who hold the traditions that teach us to care for the earth. We close our ears to your creative, reconciling, and sustaining word that calls us through the scriptures. Creation cries out as forests crackle, and animals alike flee the fires of injustice that we have lit by our unwillingness to listen. In this season of creation, we pray that you would call to us, as from the burning bush, with the sustaining fire of your Spirit. Turn us from our inward gaze. Teach us to contemplate your creation and listen for the voice of each creature declaring your glory. Give us hearts to listen, enlighten us with your grace, and fill us with the hope to quench the fires of injustice with the light of your healing love that sustains our common home. In the name of the one who came to proclaim good news to all creation, Jesus Christ. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Thank you, friends. This three-part presentation, I will give an overview of the Inflation Reduction Act and our Encounter campaign, and then delighted to hand it off to our founder, Dan Misla, who will then hand it off to our wonderful colleague at Catholic Energies, Dan Last. And so with that, I'm going to share screen and go through a rather quick blitz through the Inflation Reduction Act. Buckle your seatbelts. Okay, here we go. The Inflation Reduction Act is a historic commitment to a historic national commitment to climate action. And as I mentioned earlier, having worked for well over a decade on climate legislation, this is a pivotal moment in human history where we are seeing an express national commitment to climate action, a tipping point, if you will. Now, not everything is in here that gets us where we need to go, but it is an act in that direction. And so I'm going to go through some of the features of this act. First to note, and First, actually, to state that I am borrowing from the wisdom and research of other organizations. And at this particular point, thanking the Rocky Mountain Institute for these slides, which they presented to the All America is All In community, going over this act. So first to note that there is a historic level of federal investment, not just in IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, but also recently passed or during the Biden administration, the CHIPS and Science Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And if you look at that column on the right, you will see that there will be close to $80 billion per year over the next 6 years for federal investments in climate action. Also wanting to note that, for example, these other two acts below add to research and development and seeking to make innovative technologies scalable and commercially viable that would then result in deployment and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Overall, IRA is expected to reduce emissions 40% by 2030. And what you're seeing here, this source is from the REPEAT project, but there were two other projects, two other groups that did similar analyses, the Rhodium Group and Energy Innovation, all of which estimated that overall greenhouse gas reductions, national greenhouse gas reductions, would be about 40% by 2030. Now, noting that we are not reaching the target that we, the United States, promised under the Paris Agreement, which is 50% by 2030. But again, it is getting us down the path. And this also has international benefits, because as we know, in the previous administration, there was no support for climate action. And in the international climate negotiations, it caused the world writ large to slow down their commitments to greenhouse gas reductions. And global greenhouse gas reductions are what we need to avert climate catastrophe. Now the United States can come to the next conference of the parties in Egypt with meaningful, tangible commitments that can then help us lead and inspire other nations to do the same. With regard to on-the-ground benefits, what is in this act particular? If you are an individual, a homeowner, a family of low or moderate income, if you are living in an environmentally compromised community, if you are a farmer, a forester, small business owner, a tribal nation, a local or state government, a community-based organization, a nonprofit, a church, a school, a hospital, a large business, a manufacturer, or an investor, there is something in IRA which will benefit you. They are all carrots or all incentives, and there's only one stick, and that relates to methane emissions. So just going to go very quickly through what some of those features are. First, a timeline with regard to when this act became law on August 16th. And then you'll see there's a timeline for deployment, but I won't get into that too much. Okay. So as many of you know, well, you may or may not know, there have been tax credits in the past to incentivize solar and wind energy. These tax credits have been extended, and they've also been extended to other forms of non-carbon intensive energies. And you'll see here extensions to 10 years. I'll stop. I don't want to go too much into it, but also with regard to storage, utility scale storage, and also incentives for community solar and low income projects. Seeing some of this expansion as it relates to hydrogen energy, advanced manufacturing, production tax credits for battery and solar, again, methane emissions, advanced industrial facilities. For example, concrete involves a lot of carbon intensive energy. How do you move them away from that? A green bank, if you will. And then carbon capture and sequestration, which is a controversial technology. On the building sides of things, there's incentives to make buildings and homes more energy efficient. There are also benefits for families to do some, to purchase at rebate cost more energy efficient appliances. and also funding for building codes, which is really important because when you establish those standards for more energy efficiency, that is a trickle-down effect across the entire supply chain and also the construction. Going back to, for example, families, and I'm going to talk, before I continue, I'm going to talk about families, benefits to families with regard to energy efficiency in homes, electric vehicles, also environmental justice provisions, and agriculture, forestry provisions, and also benefits to tribal nations. So what you're seeing here, if there's full deployment of these aspects with regard to energy efficiency, how many homes and how many buildings will benefit from these incentives? For example, 7.3 million heat pumps installed. And I just want to do a little bit here. For example, there's a 30% tax credit for families to replace furnaces, water heaters, and air conditioners. There's a 30% tax credit for households with regard to weatherization, and low and moderate income families can replace or upgrade stoves and receive a direct rebate for those. Okay. With regard to electric vehicles, you can receive direct benefits, direct rebates for the purchase of new and used electric vehicles. For example, that instead of you having to file your tax return to receive your benefit of $7,500 or $4,000 for a used EV, that rebate transforms to a point of sale rebate. You don't have to wait to file your tax form for that. Okay, so those are EVs, and I just want to move to some very important provisions. Dan, can you see this table here? Yes, okay, thank you. So this is a table that was put together by Harvard's Energy and Environment Law Project, which breaks down the environmental justice provisions in IRA, and there are between $47.5 billion and $6 billion available to address environmental justice and to provide direct aid and direct funding to the communities suffering from environmental injustice. And I'm going to provide these links to you because there are so many. Just to note, for example, though, when you see the green on the first column, that is a direct benefit to low-income communities. So there's access to renewable energy, home and energy efficiency of the tribes, help for coal miners, protection for public housing, energy and water, energy access for tribes, domestic water access, and on in a good way. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these features. For example, if a entity like Catholic Energies wants to develop in an environmental justice community, they will get an additional 20% bonus credit, tax credit for those solar projects in those low-income communities. There are environmental justice block grants for environmental justice organizations to help them address pollution in their community. There's a full range of programs to monitor air pollution, to address contamination in public schools and disadvantaged communities. Also, with regard to tribal nations, there is funding for tribal climate resilience and adaptation programs, climate resilience for Native Hawaiian communities, drought mitigation for tribal communities, and protection for tribal fish hatchery operations. Tribes can also benefit from an electrification program and also from energy development through a tribal energy loan guarantee program. Again, you will see these. And then also moving to agriculture and forestry. Many of the USDA programs that already support conservation and environmental quality will have jump ups in their funding and support. And then, for example, will help close to 300,000 farmers apply conservation to approximately 125 million acres of land. There are also forestry programs to protect against drought and wildfires, both on non-federal land, federal land, and for private people who are private landowners. Lastly, I'll say, with regard to the Inflation Reduction Act, that there are some negatives that you may have been hearing about, which are causes for concern. For example, support for carbon capture and sequestration, which many feel is a very questionable technology. There's also opening up of more federal lands and waters to oil and gas drilling, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska. And then also there was a trade-off between Democratic Senate leadership and Joe Manchin's vote to now pursue permitting legislation that would be attached to the continuing resolution that would quicken or shorten environmental reviews for energy projects, and would open up, accelerate the continuation of the Mountain Valley Pipeline in West Virginia. So we are continuing to monitor those developments as well, but wanted to conclude by saying there is a lot in the Inflation Reduction Act that will spur climate leadership in our nation. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I am absolutely delighted to hand this off to Dan Misla, the founder of Catholic Climate Covenant. Dan.
Thank you, Jose. I'll just note there's a couple of questions in the chat that are in the Q&A box that you might want to take a look at as I start. So I'm going to share my screen. I just have a couple of slides that I want to just share with you, talking mostly about this is refers to our Catholic Energy Program. So many of you have heard this story, but around the time that Laudato Si came out, one of the things that I was trying to figure out how to answer is, how come I can't get my, that I would get asked a lot, how come I can't get my bishop, my pastor, my principal to work on these issues? And the answer, well, we have 2 World Day of Peace statements, we have Genesis, we have gospel stories about caring for creation. What's the problem? That didn't seem to suffice. So thinking about how we can get our pastors and bishops and other leaders to come to the table and begin discussing climate change and care for creation, I thought of, like any community organizer would, what's in their self-interest. And in every pastor and bishop's self-interest is always money. And we know that you can do, by doing energy efficiency projects, you can reduce your energy use by at least 10%, often more, in your buildings, just with energy efficiency. So I began searching around the community to find a partner to help with this, because it's not something that I have expertise in, and came across Dan Last, who will be sharing in a few moments. And Dan and I put together the Catholic Energies Program, and Dan's company now runs that program for us. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to show people that there is a way forward here to do energy projects. And frankly, the Catholic market has demanded solar. I think it's because it's sexy, it's visible. Putting caulking on the windows is a good thing to do, but it's not like having solar panels on your roof. So we began to respond to that market demand by developing a solar program. But I just wanted to, and Dan will share a little bit about that, but I also wanted to just demonstrate to you how much, without the IRA, without this legislation, how much the energy community is growing towards renewables. So just take wind energy as an example. Back in 2000, there was a worldwide wind capacity would reach 30 gigawatts by 2010. The reality of that is that by 2020, that goal was exceeded by a factor of 24. So lots of wind going up. This kind of the same is true with solar, but this graph shows you that from 2000 to 2020, the number of gigawatts of solar that have been installed has just escalated dramatically, and it continues to go up. And of course, a lot of market forces are involved in that. The cost of panels have come way down, but also the cost of putting these projects together has also come down. So more and more people are installing solar. Catholic Energies knows that enough solar hits the earth every hour to fill all the world's energy needs for a full year. So imagine if we can capture more of this free energy that's coming to us every day, every hour, every minute. The big project that we did, and I'll play this video while I'm talking, The biggest project that Catholic Energies has put together is a 2 megawatt solar array that we did for Catholic Charities in the Archdiocese of Washington. This project, we went to Monsignor Ensler, who you see in the picture with Cardinal Gregory. We went to him and said, "You've got 12 buildings in the Archdiocese, or in the in the District of Columbia, which is part of the Archdiocese of Washington. Why don't we plunk solar on those buildings and help you reduce your energy?" And he said, "I have a better idea. We have a field, and 5 acres of that is open space. Why don't we put solar there? And then all of the Catholic Charities buildings within the district can benefit from that." So that's what we did. This is a 2 megawatt solar array, 5,074 panels. This is on the it's on like the first base side of the DC Diamond, if you will. It's close to the Maryland border. It's right off the Maryland border, in fact. And this solar array produces, as I said, 2 megawatts of power. It's saving the Catholic Charities and their energy costs about $200,000 a year just on energy savings from this array. There's another 185,000 or so that goes to it's a lease payment. This array is owned by another company. That money is going to offset the cost of the deferred maintenance on that building that you see in the upper left-hand corner, where Mother Teresa's nuns work to do hospice care for indigent people in DC. And then in between the panels are pollinator plants. So there's really nothing to not like about this project. Saving money, saving the environment, providing habitat for pollinators, helping to do this maintenance on this building where Mother Teresa's nuns are doing amazing work. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to do with Catholic Energies, and I hope that you will consider solar for your communities. As Dan will tell you, it doesn't work everywhere, but it works in a lot of places, and a lot more places now that the Inflation Reduction Act has become law. So that's a little quick history of Catholic Energies. We are trying to expand that program as much as we can and into other areas, and you'll hear more about that soon. Okay, so I will turn it over to my friend and my colleague who runs a company called Mission Energy, and they run the Catholic Energies program for us. So Dan Last, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dan. I am going to, can you guys see my screen? Great, okay. All right, so welcome everybody. As Dan Misla said, I am Dan Last. I'm the program manager for the Catholic Energies program. I also run a company called Mission Energy, which, as Dan told you, runs this Catholic Energies program. So I'm going to focus here today, get down the weeds a little bit more, very specific about solar. In particular, we'll talk a little bit about energy efficiency as well. But I really want to focus in on solar first, and then particularly how the Inflation Reduction Act here, which you're going to hear me refer to a lot, I need to go back one slide actually, as IRA, is structured to really sort of benefit nonprofits. So first of all, as Jose very well put, this is the single largest investment into clean energy in the nation's history and perhaps in world history. So it is really an unbelievable opportunity for the country and the world here to really take action here. Virtually every technology, existing and emerging, is incentivized. There is obviously, as Jose said, some critique about some of the technologies, but within the solar realm, solar and batteries have gotten, I would say, very specific, I wouldn't say privileged, but very specific positive incentivization through IRA. As Jose also said, this really does increase the emphasis on communities which have been negatively impacted by energy production. There's 2 specific provisions in IRA. One deals with what are known as energy communities, which are loosely defined as communities that are either located or adjacent to places like coal mines and other large power generating plants and things such as that. And we're just now getting our first sort of look on where those communities are. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. There's some financial opportunities for doing projects there in those areas. And then, as Jose alluded to as well, specifically low income communities as well are sort of very much incentivized through the programs here that IRA has created. Jose said carrots and sticks, lots of carrots in the terms of sort of increased incentives for solar and for wind and other technologies, and the sticks really being in the solar world, requirements that kick in the future, particularly for larger projects. And those sticks are typically tied to domestic production. So we'll talk about some of the benefits here that this IRA provides. But the stick really is, if you want to get the full amount of the credits that are due to you, you must particularly use domestic made materials. And again, they're finalizing what those percentages are here. And very much so, this levels the playing field. The story that I always tell is, just imagine, for those of you who are running or working in Catholic facilities right now, imagine your facility is on one side of the street, a Walmart on the other side of the street. You both do the exact same solar project. Pre-IRA, the Walmart would have gotten at least a 26% tax credit this year for doing that particular project, plus a bunch of other benefits, which you as the nonprofit would have not gotten. And what IRA does is it really levels the playing field through some unique mechanisms to make it so that the Walmart and the church or the hospital, whatever it happens to be, are treated relatively equally. So specifics for solar. So previously, nonprofits who paid cash for a project, either paid cash, financed, or leased a project, would forfeit what was known as the investment tax credit, or the ITC. The ITC has been around for many years in the solar world, and for much of its history had sort of been at 30%, which goes back to my Walmart story, basically 30% of the capital cost of that project. And what happened back 2 years ago was that was set to kind of begin to go down, and it was leveled off at 26%. And at the end of this year, it was scheduled to go down once again, and then once again next year until it went away. But what's happened over the past decade has been this roller coaster where just before the ITC was supposed to go down, Congress comes in and does something, and boom, it comes back up, and eventually everybody in the solar community sort of just sat around waiting for this fix to happen, which is just not a good way to do business. So what the IRA does is it levels the ITC and what we'll talk about here, the direct payment, for 10 years. So through 2032, before there is another scheduled step down, and whether that will happen is a conversation for another day. So again, the certainty that this provides the entire industry is unprecedented. What IRA also does, and this is very specific to nonprofits, direct payments, which basically take the place of the investment tax credit. Catholic organizations, nonprofits do not pay taxes. You would not be able to take the investment tax credit. The direct payment is in lieu of the ITC. So consider it basically almost the same thing. Rather than get a credit once you file your taxes, this would be a direct payment made by the Treasury Department to the nonprofits. And as I'll make clear a couple times throughout this, the rules around the timing of all of that are still being written. And we expect to know more towards the end of this year. But it's written into law. This will be in fact the case. And we're just working on understanding exactly when and how that process will take place. I talk here about some of the adders. So that 30% is the fixed amount. And again, we're talking here about projects that are less than 1 megawatt. I know many of you don't have a concept of what that is. Just going back to what Dan Misla showed you a bit ago, that Catholic Charities project was 2 megawatts. It would be very rare to put a 1 megawatt project on a roof of any Catholic facility. So I'm really going to focus in more on the less than 1 megawatt projects here, because for most people on the webinar here, that's going to be most appropriate for you. But as I say here, 10% for domestic content requirements, 10% for siting and energy communities, and then an additional 10% for low-income communities. So it is possible that this direct payment and the corresponding investment tax credit could be worth as much as 60% in certain situations, which is really just truly game-changing. Imagine $1 million project suddenly costing $500,000. And I'll go into the economics here in a bit, but it's truly changed pretty much everything. I do not want to lose focus though. Some of you who may be familiar, who have looked into solar before, some of you may have it on your own homes, may have heard of something called a power purchase agreement, PPA for short. It is probably the most widely used contract structure for solar. What it essentially does is an investor puts forth 100% of the capital required for the project. And what you as the host, the church, the nonprofit that you run does in exchange for that is agree to pay this investor a fixed amount for your electricity for the life of the contract, which, as I say here, typically 20 to 25 years. So essentially what this does is this makes this investor sort of like another utility for you. So you have your utility company with adding solar to your facility, the amount of energy you draw from the utility hopefully goes to zero or close to it. And you have this new utility, which is really just this investor that's funded this solar array for you. And the goal, Catholic Energy's goal, is to create savings through that. So if you were paying 10 cents for every kilowatt hour that you were drawing from your utility, we want to be able to deliver a power purchase agreement that gives you 9-cent power. And the other benefit of that, as an example, 9 cents, 8 cents, 9.5 cents, it depends on the specific project. The other thing that this does is this really creates that nice smooth curve cost certainty, because what the power purchase agreement does is it has fixed escalators in every year. So many of you are living in states right now, we've seen it ourselves, where lots of spikes in energy costs, especially with the war in Ukraine and all these other global issues. This allows you to budget every year. So whether you go with the direct ownership model, which was what we talked about previously, this idea of owning it yourself, or a PPA, what you are certainly getting is a whole lot more cost certainty than you had previously. Comparing these two structures, and again, these are not the only two out there, but these are the primary two that we're going to focus on here. Just to make clear a few things. So in a PPA scenario, the investor owns pretty much everything, including the equipment and the requirements to keep that equipment up to date, warranty requests, O&M, so on and so forth. All of the credits, the investment tax credit, et cetera, all goes towards the investor. And again, the host, the Catholic organization, in my example here, gets the benefit of a lower cost of power. So it's the trade-off that you're making there. Direct ownership, you, the host, own the equipment. So what we're working on now is including operations and maintenance agreements right into these contracts, so that you have that similar kind of level of certainty that somebody knowledgeable is going to be servicing the array when needed. Upfront cost is the responsibility of the host. It can be financed, and we have financing options as well that we work on for those organizations who do not. But then all of the financial benefits come directly to the host. So again, if there's that direct payment, any of the renewable energy credits, any other rebates are paid directly to the Catholic organization. So it comes down to a choice really that these organizations have. Which do they want? For organizations that have potentially, let's say, loan covenants, cannot borrow any more money and don't have the cash, PPAs work in a majority of states, not every state, but a majority of states. For organizations that do have the capital, though, we are beginning to steer more and more of them towards a direct payment scenario. I know this is an eye chart. I'm not going to spend the time to go through all of this. Some of you who may have worked with Catholic Energy in the past have gone through this. These are the very detailed analyses that we do for all of our clients to help compare and ultimately help these organizations make decisions about what the project should look like and how to finance. On the left side here, the far left side, you'll see we talk about the utility, basically how much solar is produced, what cost is being avoided by not paying the utility, and the corresponding savings. And then this is a PPA example. You can see this is what the example here is, that the host is currently paying 9.97 cents for electricity. And in the PPA scenario, they would pay 9.25 cents. That's going to generate about $5,000 of savings in the first year. And over the course of a 25-year PPA is projected to save the organization about $530,000. And this is a real project. So this is not made up. This is a real project we're developing for a Catholic school in Maryland. On the right side of my screen, you can see the same analysis here on the left, so the same solar production and avoided costs. But rather than have the solar PPA rate, we're now adding in an addition. So in Maryland, many states have what are known as renewable energy credits, just considered another credit, another rebate that's offered, and that's going directly to the organization, to the host. So what you can see here is the savings are significantly larger. In year one, they're going to have to pay $1.6 million for the project. And then at the end of that, they're going to get about a $480,000 credit. This is assuming that 30% direct payment going directly back to this Catholic school. But what I really want to focus on here are the bottom numbers, and I've circled them. So the PPA example would deliver about $530,000 in savings over the course of 25 years. In exchange for that is no upfront cost required for the host. You don't have to put out a single dollar. If, however, the school is able to come up with, or we as Catholic Energies are able to facilitate financing for the project, the school could save almost 3 times as much over the course of 25 years. Now, what's not included here, we have to add a little bit back in for operations and maintenance and things like that, but that's pretty minimal. Consider it maybe a couple to a few $1,000s at most a year. But overall, you can see the bottom line here is there's the direct ownership option is significantly better financially, assuming, of course, that you are able to put out the upfront capital and are willing to wait. What we're hearing right now is that this direct payment that you can see here in year one, this $480,000, probably will take as much as a year to come back to nonprofits. Again, we're just waiting to find out. Treasury, IRS are working on rules right now, and we expect by the end of this year or very early in January to have the final details. Other considerations for solar, I want to make sure I make clear. So roofs are, roof is a 4-letter word for those of us who work on solar, because it can be, it's a great place to site solar, but it can also be a big pain in the butt, depending on the quality of the roof. In a PPA scenario, most investors won't consider putting solar on a roof that's greater than 10 years old because it's just so close to needing to have work or replacement done. And direct ownership, we can certainly do whatever a host wants us to do. In certain circumstances, we can actually finance any roof replacement as part of a project. I'd say that's in very select circumstances, depending on the state and certain scenarios, which we can certainly cover with you. So considering your roof, doing roof replacements in advance of a solar project or in time with a solar project is certainly beneficial. Energy storage is a huge piece. You'll hear very briefly today, but I really encourage those of you who are interested in this to consider this more. Energy storage has always been allowed if you have solar as part, battery storage as part of a solar project. Even if you did the 2 projects separately, you could qualify for the tax credit. If you were able to get the tax credit, they could do them separately. Now, if you did a standalone energy storage project, which is almost certainly not something that anybody on this webinar is going to do, standalone energy solar projects are now qualified for the direct payment of the tax credit if you wanted to do that. But the real point I want to make here about storage is for those organizations seeking greater resiliency. I'm thinking of those of you who are in Texas, who have been in California, where the rolling brownouts and have really become, unfortunately, the norm. We're looking at this right now for projects that we're doing in Puerto Rico. These are real opportunities to make your place of, whether it's your place of worship, your school, your organization, a real, I don't want to say hub, but a place that the community goes to in a time of an emergency, in a time of a brownout or a storm or a natural disaster. Storage is a great option. Many states, Massachusetts for one, have California as another, have very specific programs to incentivize solar. In fact, in Massachusetts right now, I cannot install a project greater than 500 kilowatts unless it has battery storage. So there's a lot of states that are moving this direction. So definitely would be eager to talk to anybody more about storage opportunities if you're so interested in it. My last point I just want to make here, car canopies. For those of you who may have worked with me in the past, these are my pet project. I love car canopies. I spend a lot of time looking at Google Earth images of parishes and schools and hospitals. And what drives me crazy is the vast amount of real estate that's usually set aside for parking. Great opportunity to add canopies there. Unfortunately, much like roofs, the car canopy structure itself doesn't create any savings. It's just an extra cost. But with the price of steel beginning to come down, supply chains leveling out a bit more, and many states incentivizing car canopies, there are opportunities to have that cost covered substantially, if not entirely, as part of our project that we develop. And for those of you who have had to walk to wherever you happen to walk to in the summer or in a snowstorm, the intrinsic value of having covered parking might be worth the extra cost for many organizations. So certainly something we've got expertise doing. We are finishing right now a large car port structure in New York City for the Order of the Passionists, and it's just a wonderful project. I'd be happy to share pictures with anybody afterwards who's interested. I want to briefly touch on energy efficiency, just so it's not forgotten. IRA increased the value of the deduction that commercial buildings can take for energy improvements. This is separate from some of the programs that Jose was mentioning that are very specific to residential customers. Previously, there was really not a mechanism for nonprofits to take advantage of these things. So these would be upgrades to building envelope, things like doors, windows, insulation, heat pumps, LED lighting, those types of efficiency provisions. What IRA does is it creates a way for the designers of energy efficient buildings, that would be the general contractor who really is focused on procuring the materials, designing the projects, to actually take the benefit themselves and thereby sort of pass it through to a nonprofit. So while there's no opportunity for a nonprofit like with solar to get a check back from the government, the expectation when these rules are fully developed will be that your contractor or whoever's working on that project for you can take it and then pass it along to you directly. So again, it's a great opportunity for folks who have struggled to maybe find the motivation or money. I would encourage you to sort of reach out, and we'd be happy to talk more about how to work with you on energy efficiency upgrades. Key takeaways before we pause for questions here. IRA really is a game changer. I can't underscore that. For nonprofits, it could not have been just a better situation. You can always say you can ask for more, but it encompasses and included pretty much everything that we would have wanted it to in some shape or form. The rules are still being finalized. We expect them, as I said, later this year or early next year. Fortunately, many of these rules already exist in some form. So there's just tweaks really to the language that Treasury is making right now. So we don't expect it's going to take a long time, but they do have, I think, until sometime early in Q1 or middle of Q1 to actually publish these regulations, but we expect it to be faster than that. That does not mean, however, that you should not and cannot begin project development right now. Solar projects development process can take many months, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the project. So long as these projects are not what's known as placed in service, which means that we don't actually flip the switch and turn the power on before next year, you can begin project development, you can begin permitting, you can begin construction. And given at this time of year, I don't think we get probably further than project development, but you can certainly begin all of this work now and wait for the final rules to be written to understand the details. There are opportunities for everybody. Unless you are completely off the grid, there is an impactful project that I think IRA could help you facilitate. So certainly consider everything that may have been on your wish list, and we can help. Catholic Energies, we've developed more than 30 projects. I think we're actually approaching 40 now, 14 states plus Puerto Rico, ranging from everything from the 2 megawatt project that Dan Misla showed you earlier, down to 100 kilowatt small roof project for some parishes here in Virginia. We've worked on roof projects. We include lighting in many of our projects. So we really are here to help. We are we're your resource to try to help make sense of this. One final thing before I do want to stop so that questions can go on is really think about, these are complicated projects. There's a lot in them, a lot to put together. We have just recently right now, actually, there's a project that we're looking at in California that had been developed substantially, and this organization was about to move ahead on until we stepped in. They came to us and said, hey, can you just take a look at the economics here, make sure that the project works right? And we found a bunch of stuff that needed to be changed. So certainly these are complicated projects, I would say, especially at the commercial scale. I wouldn't ever recommend sort of doing them fully on your own, and we'd be happy to speak with anybody who has questions to help make this an easier and smoother process for you. And with that, I will pause for any questions we have.
Dan, I've answered a bunch of them as you were talking, but one question is for car canopies, how would it impact rain runoff, flooding, drainage, and all of that? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, it shouldn't impact it much. In many places, DC being one of them, New York being another, we have to do those studies as part of the permitting process. But you're not really adding to, unless you're doing it over a dirt or a gravel parking lot, you're not really adding an impermeable surface. You're just raising the impermeable surface up over the ground. So should not be much of a concern unless, like I said, you're doing it over something that's not currently paved. And like I said, many jurisdictions require us to do additional studies to make sure that that is in fact the case.
Great. Let me see if there are questions that I answered that I probably got wrong. But because you're the expert on this, I know, but only by the fact that I listen in on some of these conversations. Let's see. Can you comment on the buyback by utilities? And I said this is known as net metering. Is that correct? Utility
Correct.
buying any excess energy. I think this was a question asked by Anthony. So I don't know if you want to comment any more on, I know some utilities don't have net metering and so forth.
Sure. So there are three things that this is the way I typically answer this question. Three things that can be sort of spelled doom for solar projects. And IRA doesn't fix all of this. It helps some of it. The first is, I get asked this question a lot. Who are your competitors? There's lots of folks doing solar development out there. What I always say is our chief competitor is your existing utility company. So if you are in the Midwest, the South, where energy costs are comparatively cheap, it's been hard. It's hard for us to be able to find a way to fund the solar project and compete with very inexpensive, unfortunately, very dirty power. What IRA does is the direct ownership, the direct payment option allows us to, again, when you take that 30 or 40 or 50 or even 60%, it helps make that cheap cost of power possible. So that's one barrier that I would say IRA does help. There are two more, however, that are not addressed, and I will get to the net metering question in a second. Power purchase agreements, PPAs, as I mentioned, are basically a third-party investor setting themselves up as a competitor to your utility company. There are many states, Florida included, North Carolina among them, that do not like competition, and the legislatures and the PUCs, public utility commissions, have been so inclined to keep competition out. So power purchase agreements are typically not allowed in those states. This IRA doesn't do anything for that, in which case the direct ownership model or perhaps a lease are on the table. So that's another barrier that unfortunately IRA doesn't do a whole lot about. The net metering piece, I think, is where the question was getting to. So the third obstacle that some utilities throw up, there's really two flavors of it. One is what we know as net metering cap. So those of you who don't know what net metering is, basically if you put solar on your roof or next to your building, most of the time you're plugging in to the building. It's what's known as a behind the meter solar project. So you're plugging that, so those electrons are flowing into your building, but when you don't need those electrons, they flow in the other direction and they go back to the utility. That's what's known as net metering. And at the end of a billing period, net, what you've used, what you've taken, what you've given back, that's sort of balanced out. Some utilities put a limit on the amount of energy that you can net meter. Nebraska comes to mind, Missouri comes to mind, Kentucky comes to mind. 25 kilowatts is sort of the limit. So again, IRA doesn't do anything about that. The other thing that net metering can happen is that some utilities basically say that you have, in some circumstances, you can't net meter at all. You have like that minute, you have to true up your account, if you will. The best states, though, states like New York and some of the other states, you have as long as 20 years to use those credits. So if you finish a year with more going back to the utility than you've used, you have 20 years to use those credits. You can just keep building them up. Other states, the most typical amount is a year. You typically have a whole calendar year. So you may produce a lot of solar in, let's say, April, May, June, not a lot of solar in December, January, February, and it all sort of evens out. IRA doesn't do anything to address those net metering issues. So in certain circumstances, even though we have the direct payment option, we want to do it, we are limited by the amount of energy that we can put on the facility. So some still considerations and concerns. And again, that was one of the issues we got into in California. As I mentioned earlier, just some missized projects that weren't going to be able to take full advantage of the credits. That's why we always recommend having somebody take a deep dive on those designs.
Okay, two other questions that are related from Anthony and Terry. Does Catholic Energies work only with Catholic organizations? And then and then are there other organizations that work with Christian nonprofits? So let me answer that. So Catholic Energies does work just with Catholic organizations. Mission Energy, Dan Last's company that runs Catholic Energies for us, does work for other nonprofits. They are becoming experts in doing solar projects for nonprofit organizations. So they have most of their
work with a number. We work with a vast majority are Catholic, just through the Catholic Energies program. But as Dan said, we only work with nonprofits, but we work with nonprofits of all stripes. So if you can either contact us through the Catholic Energies website, we'd be happy to chat with you. Or if you want to go to the mission.energy, you can contact us there, or you can email us afterwards. I'd be happy to chat with you.
Lauren asks, my parish is beginning a master planning process, currently gathering input from the community. Where would Catholic Energies come into that process? I really want to be on top of this. I really want it to be on top of mine.
So Dan, you can even talk a little bit more about this. I mean, this goes to some of the larger projects that Dan Mizzle and I have been thinking about doing, everything from, measuring, doing a sort of a complete energy analysis of buildings. We'd be happy to engage. One project example, one of my favorite projects actually was a project we did for Catholic Charities of Southern Nevada in Las Vegas. They were doing a big master plan, a big capital campaign to do a bunch of work. And we were able to we financed for them solar, a brand new white roof, and a full comprehensive LED retrofit for, it was about 7 different buildings within their facility there. So it's good to engage early so that we can help you understand sort of all the pieces that can go in. Just reach out to us, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you.
Great. Another question. Let's see. I'm bouncing back and forth here between questions. So one question would be: can a storage project also serve as emergency power in a disaster?
Yes, in certain circumstances. There are safety mechanisms in place to make sure that the people are working on the line. The power is only going by one direction. You don't want to be sending electrons out if someone's working on a power line. But yes, that's the whole point of the resiliency center, is really to make sure that in the event of an emergency power outage, the misconception is that if you just have solar, if your power goes out, you still have power. That's not the case. The power automatically shuts off, like I said, so that electrons don't flow back. But with batteries, you can set them so that the power continues to come in and the batteries continue to charge.
Great. Patrick, I think that may also answer your question. You had a similar question, but let's see. So from Jim to Harport. Hello, Jim. What are the key aspects of a potential site that are most critical for success?
So if we're talking about solar, obviously you want to have great access to sun, south-southwest exposure, availability of a good location is important. Oftentimes we will get beautiful churches, for example, that don't want to put solar on a slate or a Spanish tile roof. So we have to take that into consideration. For ground mounts, so we've done a number of them. Most projects are on the roof, and not all ground projects are as large as the Catholic Charities projects. But for a ground project, what you need to consider is how far away that project is to the building, because again, you're going to be tying this almost always back to the building. And if you have a long run, let's say 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet between a field and your building, you're going to lose quite a bit of power along the way. So we have to build a bigger system and just lose power. So those are typically, you want to have a good location that you're comfortable building on, that's has ideally south-southwest exposure or can have that. And if it's a ground array, you want it to be pretty close to the actual facility itself.
Great. Got time for maybe a couple more questions. So this is from David. Let's see. Many dioceses don't have a lot of money. Are there financial models where parishes and schools under the diocese can buy in to a collective project? This is not a PPA question. I'm wondering how a diocese could provide a direct ownership option for a large solar project that parishes and schools can participate in. Economies of scale.
I love the question. We're exploring this in a couple different places right now. So this doesn't work everywhere. I would describe it what's generally known as virtual net meter. And what that basically means is somebody builds technically what's called a community solar project. So it's a solar project on land that they own. So let's say the diocese in this example owns a big field, and the diocese would receive a lease payment from whomever is building the project to put the project on that land. And every jurisdiction is different as far as what's allowed. It's based on state law and based on utilities, but parishes or schools or homeowners can buy in to the solar produced there. Now that solar in that example is not behind the meter. It's not going back into anybody's building. It's just going back to the grid, and the electrons are being mixed in with everybody else's electrons, right? But you as a homeowner, you as a parish, you as a school could say, great, I use 1,000 kilowatts a month. I want to buy 1,000 kilowatts from this solar project. And again, in a direct ownership model, diocese could choose to pay for this with cash, finance it, get the direct payment. All of that still stays the same. And it could sell off chunks of the power so that, again, any organization, Catholic or not, has access to that power. Again, it is state specific. And we'd be happy to talk more with you about how your diocese might be able to do it.
Okay, we've got just a couple minutes left. Maybe instead of trying to answer some of these more technical questions, what we can do is we'll capture this Q&A and we'll respond to you directly on some of these questions. I think that's the way. Positive. Is that the way it would work, or do we send it to the whole group, or how would you suggest we do that?
I will send the tech questions that haven't been answered to you, and you can respond. If we have questions that you think can be answered to the full group, we would add them to the email that goes out.
Okay, that sounds great. Good. Yeah. Okay. I think that's all we really have time for at the moment.
Great, thank you, Dan. I'll just close this out briefly. If you have any additional questions, please email us at info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. Also noting that this recording will be made available to you, the slides as well, within the next 48 hours. And we hope to answer any questions that you may have in due time. So it's been a real blessing to journey with all of you today. And thank you, Dan, for these wonderful presentations. And I hope, folks, that you have gained a lot. And thank you, Paz, for being—
You're welcome. And I apologize about the chat snafu. Somehow it got disabled completely. Major apologies.
Great. Thank you, friends. Have a blessed day.
Bye, everybody.